The first is to always use insecticides responsibly. So these insecticidal products like you see shown here, these are tools. These are things that you need as part of an integrated approach to collect or to kill plant feeding insects or to help control things that are attacking you on your person. These are a part of that toolbox, and there's no reason to say that they have to go away. There's synthetic ones, there's organic ones, but they are part of an integrated approach. Part of our responsibility, though, is to practice good insecticide stewardship. If you misuse your tools, you're not doing yourself, the environment, or beneficial non-target insects like pollinators any favors. We have to use these things properly. If we don't, we see situations like we saw in Oregon a few years ago. Some folks treated plants against the label in a way that was hazardous to pollinators, and they killed 50,000 pollinating insects. It says on the label how not to do that, and they ignored that advice and performed a service that was dangerous. That is irresponsible. That's not right. If we use these products correctly, we can stop this from happening, and we can control the pests that we don't want around anymore, but we don't have to harm things that we like pollinators. So when we use insecticides, they can be put out in different formulations. Some are granular, some are liquid, some are seed coatings, but as general homeowner type folks, you're probably going to use granular or liquids, maybe a powder every so often, but these are usually the most common. And when you use a granular, it dissolves and is absorbed by the plant. A liquid formulation can be systemically absorbed by the plant, or it can just protect the leaves. The question here is, when you're applying these products, are you contaminating flowers? Either directly, when you spray a liquid, does it get into a flower and poison a pollinator? Or does a plant absorb enough from the soil to systemically transfer insecticide from down here in the root zone up into the leaves, the stem, and then the flowers to harm pollinators? This has always been the big question. I did some research in Kentucky for my PhD that was sort of centered around this. I'm a turfgrass entomologist by training, so we worked in turf with turf weeds, and we treated these with these areas like you see in the left, with liquid insecticides at label rate. We irrigated them. We did everything like a lawn care service would, except we treated flowers when we weren't supposed to. We put these tents up that you see in the right-hand image, and inside of the tent we put colonies of bumblebees, and we forced them to feed on these treated flowers, and we looked at their overall health to see what impacts we could see. We looked at a neonicotinoid insecticide and a newer kind of insecticide called an anthranilic diamide, and we were making comparisons between these two classes. What we found is when we went and looked in on the bees and counted them up at the end of the season, that exposure to the neonicotinoid had led to greater impacts in the hive when they fed on these treated flowers. About 34% mortality for the neonicotinoid compared to about 6% for the other insecticide in the control. So this is strong evidence that they can harm pollinating insects. But we went through in these tents and we mowed all of the treated flowers out and let new ones grow in. And when those new flowers grew up and new colonies of bees fed on those new flowers, there were no effects. These colonies were healthy. So direct contamination created a scenario where the bees were harmed. Systemic transfer wasn't enough to kill the pollinators. We followed that up and showed even further that levels in weeds and turf, when you mow afterwards, those flowers that pop back up, they have about 8 nanograms per gram of the insecticide in there. So that's at way below lethal levels for these insects, way below sublethal levels. When you directly contaminate it, the levels are really, really high, around 5,500 nanograms per gram. So that's pretty dangerous for a pollinator. This is good data to have for a lawn. There's more data still coming in for other plants that we treat, like ash trees or shrubs that we try to protect. And things could change in those different plants because certain plants transfer insecticides in different ways. But what it looks like in turf is that the mowing helps to remove some of the negative effects. Some other data that we collected showed that neonicotinoids gained weight at a slower rate, and they produced fewer queens overall than the anthranilic diamide insecticide. This is just a demonstration that different insecticide classes have different effects, and that these effects can be lethal, like the mortality that we talked about, or if they're exposed to enough insecticides, it can impact long-term things like queen production. And so the neonicotinoid did impact those things while the newer insecticide didn't. So there are differences amongst classes, and there's different ways of avoiding this issue. To practice good insecticide stewardship, be sure you never treat the blooms of trees, shrubs, weeds, or annual plants. If you get insecticide into the flower, you will kill pollinating insects. So always treat after petal fall, or don't treat the plant at all if it's blooming. If it ever blooms with a synthetic product, try an organic or biorational product like neem oil or BT, or a synthetic product like acelepryn. These products pose less hazard to pollinators. Always check insecticides for what's called the bee diamond. This will tell you if it has a special hazard to pollinating insects and how to avoid creating that situation. So we can use these tools, we just have to use them right. And if we do that, we're not going to poison our pollinating friends. There's some other things you can do, like remember that weeds are flowers too. Natalia, what is the email signature that you have?
Weeds are flowers too once you get to know them.
Weeds are flowers too once you get to know them. So things like dandelion and clover, while we consider them a pest, they actually feed a lot of pollinating insects. I did a test in Kentucky that showed over 50 different species visited just these two lawn weeds. And it included honeybees and bumblebees and flies and mining bees, all different kinds of diversity. So if we can let clover and dandelion live a little more, social bees and butterflies and flies and solitary bees will benefit more. And you can even do this in an urban area. We found that we could compare urban to rural populations of weeds and show that pollinators still exist in an urban area. We think that cities and towns may not have as much biodiversity, but if we look closer at the situation, we find that in a park like this one that you see here, that's surrounded by pavement and concrete, if you look at the population of pollinators there, maybe it's really not that different from its rural counterpart. So we looked at 18 parks in Lexington, Kentucky, and I figured out how much concrete and pavement were around them. And we ended up with 7 urban sites, which is 20% or more of the area covered in pavement and concrete, 4 suburban sites, which are 13 to 16%, and 7 rural sites, less than 10% of the area covered in hardscape. And when we sampled pollinators in these different areas, we found that diversity is just as high in the city as it is in a rural area. So if we now found 9 species of bee in a rural place, we were just as likely to find 9 species of bees in the city. There are differences in what 9 that you find though. And the biggest difference was in bumblebees and honeybees. The more urbanized an area is, the fewer bumblebees we saw. And the more urbanized an area was, the more honeybees we saw. So basically, bumblebees seem to be more of the country folk, the farmer folk, while bumblebees seem to be the more cosmopolitan city slicker types. There could be lots of reasons for this happening. There could be just food resources, all different kinds of things at play here that impact this diversity. But something is happening that changes these dynamics. But it's important to show that even if you live in town or if you live in a big city like Omaha, you can still contribute to pollinator conservation by having weeds, by not using insecticides incorrectly, and by making intentional pollinator plantings, which Natalia will tell you about here this evening. So we're going to switch slots. That's fine.
That's ridiculous.
Go for it.
Good?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Is that this keyboard or that one? Okay, so like Jonathan said, the biggest way to help, or maybe one of the easiest ways to make a contribution as far as pollinator plantings goes, are in fact planting for pollinators and not just for your own garden landscape gratification. But in an ideal situation, you'll marry the two and come up with a pretty nice landscape. So even though Jonathan has these pictures in his slide, what you really need is this one. Because this is the Nebraska pollinator habitat, as you can read. Excuse me. This is the sign, the outdoor sign that anybody that becomes certified with the Nebraska Pollinator Habitat Program that we started this last year is eligible to have. And we'll talk about that more towards the end. And that was actually the main part of why I joined tonight, was to talk about the pollinator habitat certification program. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about other things that you can do to encourage pollinators and increase habitat.